we've always kind of thought of that like freelance lifestyle as not just being professional. It's like making, taking the road less traveled, both personally and professionally. But yeah, I think that really was brought into very sharp relief by like the circumstances. Welcome to Don't Think Twice. Vijay and Stevens is the writing and producing duo of Amrita Vijay and Andrew Stevens. Best friends, business partners, creative partners, and now soon to be co-parents. We started our path to co-parenting in 2020 by creating and freezing embryos. In this week's episode, friend, host, and clinical psychologist Marina Weiss walks us through that process, from getting our heads shrunk to getting our ovaries prodded.
So I understand that this initially began with a plan to freeze embryos. Talk about why you decided to take that route initially.
I think for me and for like a lot of people in our demographic, it was just kind of a way to kick the can down the road, just to delay the decision and to keep the door open, but not really make any strong commitments to anything. That's how I felt.
We were in the middle of the conversation about where Amrita was going to sit in her parenting.
Andrew felt very sure he wanted to be a parent at some point. I was not sure that I wanted to be a parent. And so the setup that we had envisioned, I think, is that if and when this actually happens, Andrew would be a custodial parent. And I would just be like an involved adult, a bonus adult. So that was like sort of the initial picture.
And why we chose to do the embryo instead of just, continue a different process that would be more immediate, was because there felt like other elements of our life that weren't fully at the place that made it comfortable to have a child. That financially, I think there still had to be more conversation about what that looked like, or thought on our own parts about what that looked like. So more just like personally what we saw ahead of us in our lives after we had a child. And so I think embryo was that stage where, biologically there is a time. So we knew that the embryo was going to solve that issue and provide us more space and time to think about the other elements of our life.
But did you ever consider the option of separately freezing gametes?
That is how ambivalent I was about the notion of being a parent myself. Was that I didn't care to prolong the process for myself.
And I hear that you're describing it as ambivalence, but I also hear it as real commitment to the idea of parenting with Andrew, right? Like that you were not comfortable with the idea of ambiguous child in the future unless it's in this context.
Well, yeah, yes. And at the time, again, I had made no commitment to being involved in this child's life beyond being fun auntie level. So really it was just kind of a commitment to being I like this idea of contributing to Andrew's ability to become a parent.
And so tell me more about how you envision the fun auntie timeline looking. You're not living with Andrew and child, you're peripheral to them, you show up how frequently, you do what?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think we hadn't answered all those questions quite yet at the time. Our lives looked very different at that time. I was single. Andrew was partnered. There was an eventuality potentially that Andrew and his partner might choose to have children together, and then I could even be called mom, and we had no problem with that kind of conceptually, because it's we get to define what mom and dad means for these, for this potential kid. That we kind of already had the idea in our own friendship and our own business partnership at this point that we were going to be in the same city. So any potential like family that we would have had, even if I had kids separately, if you had kids separately, we were already envisioning that we'd be involved in each other's children's lives already. So it felt natural that, you know, I would be like sort of the fun auntie to your children, even if they weren't biologically related to me.
So I'm hearing that this idea of chosen family was pre-existing any of the plans for biological children.
Yeah.
And the idea of chosen family was one that appealed greatly prior to any of this like actual planning.
We became friends talking about the things we wanted to do in the city with art, and it was a very organic conversation that started with, you know, wanting to make things creatively and pining for old New York when it seemed that people just fell into each other's living rooms and, you know, made things together. And what we were really saying in an arts community is having a group of intimate friends. And when we both realize that neither of us see our lives, the relationships in our lives taking more of traditional, looking in a traditional way, that I think we just naturally started to contemplate.
You know, even then at that point, I didn't really ever envision myself as being someone who was long-term partnered. Like, you know, but you know, we equate that, like you either like you opt to have a family and like opt for partnership, and or you opt to be like alone, you know, quote unquote. And that is such a like false division of, you know, you may not want to be married, but you still might want to be part of a family.
And what I hear you describing is also something that I think is a common fallacy of our individualistic lens, that we think about things just at the individual level and think like, well, you're either in a long-term committed monogamous relationship or you're completely alone. And no one is completely alone, right? Like we live in a society, like gestures at flaming dumpster, right? But like the lack of acknowledgement of the reality and importance of the social, I think is like a thing that our culture is really, you know, fails to support for us. And I think that's part of what's so radical and amazing about the decision that you have made to focus on the social and actively construct not just a community for yourselves, but a family for yourselves, that it will provide the things that you're looking for in your lives. So I know that a lot of people are probably going to be curious about how that process works. What were your first steps in that process?
Functionally, our first steps were identifying a doctor's office, a clinic, a fertility clinic.
Who then showed me a PowerPoint presentation about my diminishing fertility. All those sorts of doom and gloom scenarios for women's fertility are based on very, very limited data, and also based on data that doesn't actually account for their partner's age. So if you don't take into account that perhaps it could also be diminishing returns on the sperm value, or, you know, motility, viability, then, you know, it leaves out obviously a whole part of the picture. But anyhow, so she showed me this doom and gloom, you know, map of my fertility, and all this while, you know, you have to keep in mind, if you're a person who seeks out this type of treatment, that this is a for-profit enterprise. This is one of those areas of medicine where they are making pure profit off of, because insurance covers very little of this. You know, private companies sometimes do if you happen to work for Facebook, but for the most part, people are paying out of pocket for these very pricey things. So she's trying to sell me a bill of goods. And then we have to make a series of other decisions about, like, for instance, freezing eggs versus freezing embryos. What are the different outcomes for that? And once we make that decision, we also have to decide then who is the patient in this scenario. Is Andrew the patient and I am the donor? Or am I the patient and he is the donor?
Can I ask you, Amrita, did they talk about freezing eggs and embryos simultaneously? Is that an option?
Mm-hmm. That's definitely an option.
It is well, I believe that they would have made me do 2 cycles. The data supports that embryos tend to have a higher percentage of outcome on the other end, because what you're doing is you're sort of eliminating some of the potential areas where things could fall off on the front end instead of on the back end.
Yeah. When I froze my eggs, my ex took me to all the appointments and like picked me up from the procedure, et cetera, et cetera. And they kept being like, don't you want to freeze embryos? Like there's better outcomes on the back end. Like essentially,
So
like,
they
this
tried
is
to charge you.
but I did feel like, well, yeah, if my ex and I were at the place in our relationship where we were like agreed that that was a goal that we shared, like it would have made sense, but it was the extreme opposite. I felt like very certain that it was something that I wanted, just to have, as you said, the door
option.
open later. But I was aware that like it would have been better odds if he had been on board as well, and that wasn't something that he.
Yeah, or not necessarily like better odds. It's just that you kind of have more. You know more what your odds are.
Well,
up
but
front.
also because that's freezing the partner's sperm as well. Like it's freezing, and there is all this data that's now coming out that like paternal age is actually just under researched, because it's much easier to identify a pregnant woman as a person who's about to be a parent than a man walking into the hospital. And unfortunately, because of misogyny that's used to fearmonger women into being concerned about this and feeling like this is only like a
absolutely.
I mean,
concern
did they
for
ever
us.
ask you anything about me?
About your age or anything?
Yeah, any
No,
demographic
no,
questions?
not at all. Not at all. It really is only about like 35. That's the cliff.
When we use the term geriatric pregnancy in medicine to talk about women who are pregnant over, or people who are pregnant over the age of 35, but that is referencing very old data.
And you never
misogynistic.
really use geriatric like
No, men don't get to be geriatric until they're
Geriatric
over
dads.
70, you know?
yeah. So I'm sure you heard some of that same language and same like doom and gloom stuff when you went in for a consultation, but so it was after that I did consider, as you asked earlier, whether I wanted to just like freeze some eggs, and like, you know, was there somewhere in my mind that I thought like maybe there might be like a partner in the future that I wanted to like explore childbearing with, and then I decided no, and decided to go the embryo route. And actually what we decided to do was to have me be the patient and Andrew be the donor. But the reason for that, we were cognizant of the power dynamic of who gets to be the patient and who's the donor, the way that they set it up medically.
Seriously, to say medically in the fertility clinic, most often there are 2 attached parents, whether they are, or regardless of gender, there are two people who are there at the fertility clinic.
They're married, they're
and there might be
partnered.
a third person who is providing an egg or sperm. In our case, because we weren't partnered in the way that the fertility clinic would recognize, and in no legal way were we partnered, it had to be that one of us had to be a donor for the other person, which, as you can imagine, has legal implications.
Right. And because of our imagining of how this would look at that time, that Andrew was going to actually be the custodial parent and I wouldn't have custodial rights over this, you know, this child. So we structured it so that it would balance out the power dynamic, that like then I would technically own the embryos until such a point as they were used, and then they would get signed over, so, like more or less. And this caused all sorts of questions for them, because typically, you know, because we said, well, he's going to be the parent. And so then they said, well, but like then you can't be the gestational carrier. To me, you can't be the gestational carrier because we our policy is like, you know, they can't actually bar you from doing that, but our policy is that it's not done. You know, he shouldn't do this. He shouldn't have you like say that he wants you to be the gestational carrier, because that is going to create issues down the line.
How did you feel about that?
I mean, we have lots of things to say about it. Like,
I have a lot of things.
because we had to navigate a lot of kind of like medical red tape through the process of the embryo freezing, but it's because they have a formula that to Andrew's point, even if it's like a gay couple. So that was a formula that they understood. And then it was like two, aging New York professionals who want to delay their childbirth decision. Like that was a format that they understood, but they didn't really understand what this was. So we understood what this was. So when you ask like, how do we feel about it? It was like a little bit of exasperation, because it was like, we understand what our dynamic is. We've actually talked about it, and now we have to sort of explain everything.
We had to explain everything to people that we were paying to do a job.
Right.
I mean,
that's a good point.
To get into it, like the way, and of course we should respect doctors, but we should respect doctors to the way we respect any professional, including the mechanic who you rely on to fix your car. Frankly, I am the customer. And it's so easy in a medical setting, even when you're paying for the service, to forget that there is a dynamic there that you can push back against.
Yeah. And I also hear that their concerns were about essentially the combination of these three roles, the combination of the gestational carrier and the egg donor, meaning that you got to be too powerful. There's like a trinity, of these. I think that there's a problem in medicine which sometimes occurs where people learn about things on the population level and then they over apply them on the individual level.
That's
right.
What it
and
is.
I think you need to be curious about like, who are these people?
If it's a for-profit institution that I walk in and I say, this is the service I want, I don't understand why they feel like they can overstep that. When I go and ask for a haircut, he doesn't ask me for what I'm feeling emotionally and what's going to happen. Like it just felt there was we can get into this in a second about the next step.
Yes. So they said, well, because of your arrangement, you have to get the psychiatric fitness thing, which by the way, we again paid for the privilege.
We paid
$400 an hour.
Yes, $400 an hour to go into the fertility clinic.
Yeah.
And to have psychiatric interviews, evaluations separately,
individually,
and
and then together.
I was mad about it from the very beginning.
Yes.
I was sitting in the waiting room because we did it in the same day, and I was like, somewhere in America, somebody is getting knocked up in the back of a Honda, right? And we're here having to pay thousands of dollars to go and talk to some doctor down the hallway who's going to put a stamp of approval on our application or not? I mean, tell us that we can have a child or not?
This is such an important point. And it also makes me ask, like, did you consider going turkey baster? Like, did you consider skipping all these?
Well, we don't want to do spoiler alert, but...
we did eventually, but
we did eventually.
But at the time, the intent was to just, like I said, kick the can down the road, not to like immediately go to actually doing the thing. So I think if we had been maybe at the point where were ready to do that, we would have absolutely been like, fuck this. This is rude. The psychiatrist, ironically, was this like kindly old lesbian woman. She said, queer people have been building our families like however we want for
She had her
forever.
own family.
Yeah.
She had children.
She's like, we've been making those choices as queer people forever. But once you get an institution involved, then that institution then has a responsibility.
It's like what? She never really answered the question.
She said they have a responsibility. What do they have a responsibility for? I'm not 100% sure. But basically, now that you've involved us, it is now our responsibility to like do this vetting process.
This was an hour-long interview with Amrita, followed by an hour-long interview with me, which she was asking similar questions, but by no means was this any sort of psychological standardized. Mm-hmm. She knew a couple of questions she wanted to ask, sort of squishy questions, as if to see if we were on the same page about our roles as parents. And then after both of us had those interviews, she brought us together as if it was some like game show, and she was going to
like
reveal
the
to us
quiz or something
that we had in fact passed.
Yeah. Which spoiler alert, we passed because
before she tried to hawk her little stupid children's book at us. A children's book for children.
Oh, I'm not sure that she hawked this to me.
Was it just me?
I think it might have been just you.
That she pulled out and then
because you were going to be the dad.
Would.
Yeah.
She flipped through it slowly.
Parent.
That was you.
She's like, families come in different ways. And it was a book about like gay parents and things. And I'm sitting there like, who is this for?
Yeah.
Where am I? Why?
I paid $400
For you
Well, and
to
also-
flip through a goddamn children's
so
book.
I will say I went into this with a little bit more of a cool head than Andrew did, because I thought to myself, well, this person is a professional. Perhaps she has thought of some things that I haven't. What we learned is actually that there weren't other things, and that we went through this whole process, and then we're like, oh, we learned like nothing new. Actually, we had
talked about everything, and she was like, well, y'all are on the same page.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, thanks
Check.
that.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, one thing I will say, she was very disapproving of you not inviting your boyfriend to join the evaluation. I don't know if you recall that.
Yeah, now that you mention it.
How did you feel about that?
I had what I feel about her opinion. I didn't care about her opinion. I didn't care about her opinion before I walked in there, though. I had no open mind.
Tell us what
I
you
was
really
like
think.
my mother.
Right, I know, don't
Mine
hold
was
back.
closed. I did not appreciate the task, and I was not going to be open to it. I was polite and respectful,
Yeah,
but
of course.
so instead of telling her that I had multiple conversations with the person I was dating at the time, and had conversations with him about coming and what he felt about it and what we felt about it, I just
And he wasn't barred from attending.
no, he was welcome, but it was our conversation to have, and our decision to make. And so when she was disapproving of it, I'm sure I didn't offer her anything.
Explanation, yeah.
I know myself. I offered her nothing.
If I may ask, be as candid or not as you want, because it's obviously somebody else's privacy that we're talking about. But I was never really privy to what those conversations entailed, and I'm just kind of curious, like what that looked like for you and your boyfriend at the time.
We talked about, well, I mean, he was involved in conversations before when we were having conversations about this, and then when the process started, and the idea that one day he might be a parent, and the reason, and he wasn't brought into the embryo process because it was a real one step at a time, because again, it was at the time putting off something for another day. So the embryo really didn't feel like the beginning of a baby.
So it didn't feel to him as though he was making a decision to become a parent.
It didn't
at
feel like
moment.
that to me either.
Okay.
Because it was like, oh, we could use this embryo in 6 months. We could use it in 6 years.
We could donate it to
We
science.
could never use it.
Yeah.
You know.
So y'all were throwing down some significant chunk of money, though, like in the service of deferring this dream a bit.
Yes.
How much was it that you were putting down?
Yeah.
I would say it was probably at least $12,000. And we did do it completely out of pocket. And, to be transparent, we got some family loan money to pursue that, because that wouldn't have been in my budget at that time.
Again, time was of the essence.
And time was of the essence. So the issue was kind of like, let's just source some funds however we can, and then figure out, what does a repayment plan look like at a future date. And we were lucky enough to be in a position to have, relatives with those kinds of resources that were able to help.
But so, what I'm hearing from you is that there was this kind of dissonance between, on the one hand, like, this is a casual thing where we're not currently thinking about this as a child. And on the other hand, we're actually dropping like quite a bit of money in the service of this like thing that we're pretending is very casual and abstract. Like, how do you reconcile that now?
Knowing then what we know now, what we always know is that you don't know the future. We didn't know the future then, and we don't know what will happen now. We still have embryos frozen.
I guess the price tag was a lot. I kind of held my nose about it because I thought that the idea of delaying the choice was actually worth that price tag. And that's, I think, a decision that a lot of people have to make. And it kind of sucks that you have to put a dollar price tag on how much that choice matters to you. But for me, I was like, well, I'm unsure enough about this that I am willing to pay $10,000+ to delay that decision. And I think that's just like a personal thing that you have to, unfortunately, like nickel and dime yourself, because that's the world we live in.
So let's break down what happens when someone goes in for a procedure like this. Like what happened after your psych eval?
Basically, again, because of our relationship and because we were not romantic, we were not sexual partners, they said, okay, well, the process is for embryos then that you have to get your known donor to go to a sperm bank. He can't just like come give us the sample. He has to go to sperm bank. Then he has to get this whole barrage of tests. Then he has to give them a sample, which then they will put in the freezer for 6 months. And then he'll have to get tested again at the end of the embargo period. And then that sperm will get released. There was also this sort of element of homophobia there where it was like,
because the 6 months, to be clear, is to see the presence of
AIDS.
HIV.
Yeah, HIV, sorry. Yeah. And that was the only way that we were able to do it. So I was like, 6 months, holy shit. Like we really, like that's too long. So then they were like, well, we do have this one clinic or this one sperm bank that we have a deal with where they're able to shorten. Nobody was able to explain this, by the way, why. They're like, they're able to shorten the embargo period to 3 months.
It's because that sperm bank is located above a Dunkin' Donuts. And so the caffeine just cuts that in half.
Elucidates the presence of HIV so much faster. It's the presence of the seasonal donuts in particular. Yeah.
A good crawler. If we had said we are sexual partners,
they would have let us do it.
They would not have.
I suggested that we lie. This is how I remember it. I suggested that we lie, and then you were like, "No, like they need to learn that there are different ways of people being in the world." And like,
well, it cost me money to do that.
But an additional point is that, and I mean, just for our listeners, if anyone's not aware, like they also make such a big show in many disciplines of not accepting blood donations from gay men, and it's really laden with this like stigma around, and the homophobia and stigma around HIV, which is all really antiquated, right? But it comes from a perspective that's prioritizing the unborn hypothetical child over your real feelings and experiences and your real test results and testimony about who you are and what your behavior is, right? Like there's lots of queer men out there who are not at risk for infection of HIV because they're monogamous or because
they don't have that type of sex or whatever.
Like, and it just feels like this blanket assumption about medicine that like gay men, that gay men are at risk for HIV is a fallacy. Like lots of people are potentially at risk for HIV who are not gay men and are not treated that way, right?
So for my part, I had to sort of hurry up and wait at that point because it was like, okay, now we have to hit pause while we send Andrew to the cryobank.
Oh, my cryobank experience, very shortly. I had to go there a couple times because, of course, once you have to give the sample that then they freeze and they can't use. And then I think I had to go there maybe 3 times, but it was in fact over at Dunkin' Donuts. It did not have wireless internet. You were not allowed to connect to the internet on your phone. They only had really gross straight pornography in magazine form, and none of the rooms were soundproofed. And so it was a terrible experience. Yes. And I did in fact complain, and it fell on, what's the opposite of a deaf ear?
Sympathetic ear.
A sympathetic ear. Thank you. A sympathetic ear. And I was called into an office and I was apologized to. And I was like, oh, that's nice.
What? That it was all like Jug
The thing that seemed to really resonate with the director of the cryobank was that there was no alternative pornography. She seemed to really, I've been complaining about that for years.
She said that?
Like, yeah, she said that.
The quality of the pornography is not the concern.
Some part.
But it's the...
I was like, if you could just have internet, that'd be great. Because I went to the front desk. They put me in a room.
What does the room look like, by the way? Does it have chairs?
It has one chair, which I did not touch. And an all white room, 3 in a row. And they don't they don't care if you see the other men being escorted to the rooms next to you. So it's basically like you're like, look at the other man next to you in the eyes while you go into these like booths, right? And then the walls are constructed of cardboard essentially. And I am invited into the room. Then I come back to the front desk and I'm like, excuse me, what's the Wi-Fi? And the woman says, I'm so sorry. We can't let guests on the Wi-Fi. But sometimes you can pick up the Dunkin' Donuts Wi-Fi on the first floor.
Really coming through with that.
So I was like, so you expect me to stream something from the Dunkin' Donuts Wi-Fi? She just kind of shrugs, and I couldn't, so I couldn't get internet. So I'm trying to improvise, and I'm positioned in a room next to the supply closet, it turns out, and I'm psyching myself up. I'm getting into some sort of zone, and two people decide to restock the supply closet. And I hear crinkling, and they're unboxing things, and they're putting pins, and they're counting stock. And then like, do you want tacos for lunch? No, maybe like a hamburger. And I'm in this room completely quiet. They don't play music in the thing, which they should. So there's like,
or at least white noise.
There's nothing.
I think your next side business should be a cryobank. Just putting
with like slightly better vibes.
Yeah, just the vibes could be immaculate, right?
So I'm like, I need to poke my head out and be like, excuse me, but I can't because my pants are around my ankles.
And you're trying not to touch any of the surfaces in the room.
Right. And just one graphic detail. I won't be too graphic, but I will just say that in order to have samples that are usable in the lab and samples that are usable in embryo, the actual material cannot be contaminated by any other
lubricant
substance. So lubricant is not allowed.
Mm-hmm.
And
God.
So it's just this sad, dry affair.
Did that place get closed down?
That place no longer exists.
Yeah, that's what I recall. Yeah, so then we had to wait. And we just waited and we waited. And then then my part of the procedure, which looks very much like anyone who's getting an egg retrieval, which is that you have a controlled pumping yourself full of a cocktail of hormones to cause you to hyper ovulate basically, and then they keep checking. You get lots of wanded, what do you call them? Vaginal ultrasounds, yes. And blood tests.
And I want to interject here because when people think vaginal ultrasound, they might not understand how invasive the procedures are. It's like they're also trying to look at your ovaries, so they're just like going in there and then they're going like sideways,
moving it around,
just like a baton twirler, and you're like, hello.
And then when they decide that like the time is just right, then you take your trigger shot. And then your surgery is scheduled for 24 hours, right?
Yes.
Right? You've been through this more recently, I guess.
Yes, that's all accurate. But I think you're skipping over the weirdness of giving yourself shots in the tummy.
Oh, yes. That is a huge part of it. Like, yeah. Well, so first of all, the entire process from start to finish is significantly shorter than I thought it would be. So in most cases, it's like 12 to 14 days. But you do have to give yourself multiple shots, self-administered, which is actually bad shit because they won't give you like birth control pills over the counter, but for some reason they're like combine the serum and the powder and then mix it all together and then get rid of the air bubbles and draw the canister. It's like actually fairly complicated, like nursing, in my opinion, like a nursing level procedure that you're asked to do, that they just ask anybody just to do it at home. So and the first day that I was supposed to administer them, I just sat there for like probably at least a half an hour, like paralyzed with having to stab myself. So once I got over the barrier of like it's the self-administration, like that first one was like the really hard. But after that, I actually got used to it pretty quickly.
And for anyone in the audience who might not be familiar with this process, basically all of the shots that you take up until the trigger shot make all of your follicles ripen, and then the trigger shot makes them like ready to go. And I'm less clear on the actual science of that.
No, I think that in layperson's terms, that's exactly how I understand it too. And then the actual procedure is it's a surgery. And they put you under, but not like under general anesthesia. It's like that Twilight kind. So they literally strap you in with like a Velcro strap. So you're like confined onto
You're kind of in like a half cast for the lower half of your legs.
It's really weird.
Lot.
It's really weird. And then, and then you don't remember what happens after that. But supposedly it's only like a 15-minute procedure. For me, it was imperceptible that any time had passed at all. I guess they go in through your cervix, but the reason I say this at all is because I had an IUD in this entire time, and they were just like, you can just leave it in through the entire procedure.
Question, is your IUD hormonal?
It was, yeah.
Interesting.
I don't know how that works.
Neither do I.
Once I got my eggs extracted, then the next step is they have his sample.
So they now have all the materials to mix. Well, I should say they've done full genetic testing on both of us from blood donations to make sure that we do not have any genetic markers that might pose a problem, which shockingly we didn't.
Our genetic pools are quite far apart.
Yes. And then they introduce them to all the eggs and let it incubate. So they know that healthy sperm and healthy eggs incubate. And then do you remember how many eggs they were able to retrieve?
So I think they were initially able to get 18 or something like that. But then only 12 of those or something were mature.
Dozen eggs met the sperm and were allowed to incubate for a matter of days. And then from there, they assess the viability of the embryo itself.
Like, did they actually fertilize? And then certain number of them, like I think only like 8 of them actually fertilized. And then out of that 8, only 6 of them progressed. So by the time they get to day 5, they're calling you every day with these updates, and there's like more and more drop off. And I was like, we knew that there was a possibility that we could go through this entire thing and end up with 0 at the end. And you never know. So we ended up with 2 healthy embryos at the end of the process. I've had other friends go through this process multiple times. I had one friend who went through it twice. The first time she got 1, and then the next time she got 6. So there's a huge variability, even with the same people at the same age.
And did you learn the sex of the embryos?
Mm-hmm.
We did. Yeah.
So we have 2 healthy embryos. One's a boy, one's a girl.
But yeah, those are still there. So if we ever return to them, it's like, are they actually the elder siblings technically?
Are they the older ones? And if we don't use them, you can contact us.
I'll contact you
for $15,000, $16,000. We have family and friends discounts.
Oh yeah.
Wow, I did not realize I was purchasing them. And what might people expect once the process is done?
A big old fat bill.
Yes. The twins' rent is $1,000 a year. So it's not, by New York standards, kind of a steal. In terms of follow-up, the cynical part of me says that, the transactional part of that relationship is done for the clinic. So they really don't have that much communication with you. Once it's in the freezer, then it's just basically like, we got it on ice until you contact us for further procedures. I did get a notice when Roe v. Wade was overturned that was like, so just FYI, I'm sure you probably got the same notice. Your tissue is not affected by this That was like, that's basically the most I've heard from them since, other than the bills, since it happened.
So maybe we should stop there for today.
In our next episode, it's D-Day. Well, it's time to conceive this pregnancy. When I say we get into it, we get into it. In the meantime, you can find Marina at marinaweiss.com and us at vjandstevens.com or at vjandstevens on Instagram. That's VIJAY and Stevens with a PH.